Alright, and welcome back to the latest episode of The Adventures of the Monk and the Monarch, starring me, the Monarch, and our co host, Mildred the Monk.
Hello.
So, today we're gonna talk about one of the more well known of like your 90s anime dubbing companies, and one that was actually very important to just anime in the West in general, ADV Films. Many of us probably have some pretty fond memories of. But, as usual, until we get to that, we're going to be talking a bit about what we've been watching this past month.
Yeah, I did just finish a few days ago the assessment of Record of Ragnarok season 1 for the Parliament of Geeks. I am well aware that the manga has better portrayal when it comes to a lot of the fights in that anime. However, I am strongly of the opinion that seinen is one of the hardest genres to get right when it comes to animation, purely because of the amount of detail that's used in the manga artwork.
Yep. Some shows are very difficult to translate to live action because of that. It's just so much more money to try to animate that.
Where are you bringing live action into this?
Oh, not live action. I don't know. It's been a long day, and I'm
Um,
hurt.
I know some might bring up the '97 take on Berserk. Even that kind of cheated a lot with fade out frames and a whole lot of still shots. And of course, the 2016 version of Berserk, we don't talk about that ever. And of the four pillars of heaven when it comes to seinen, the only one that's managed to have a that's haven't managed to have a decent transition between manga to anime is Vinland Saga. I'd like to have added Kingdom to the list, but Kingdom relies on a bit of CG at times, and some of it isn't as good as others. Of course, although I will admit I have a bit of a bias against CG heaviness in anime.
I
With
think sometimes it works. It's fully dedicated to CG, like something like Land of the Lustrous, but that's kind of the outlier right now.
well, a while back I talked about the Crunchyroll original, and I
We don't
brought
need
up
to
the
talk
story of
about that.
yep, I brought up the story of X Arm and how the directors for that one, who had no animation, whose only experience in animation was some music videos at best, believed that they could do CG do a CG anime and rely primarily on motion cap, even though they were explicitly warned against it the by their own peers, especially by some of the people who are in the same studio that did Beastars. They warned them that CG that mocap is just the beginning of the thing, and you actually have to gimp motion capture to make it look like animation at times to get the feel right. They've admitted as such. The point is that some use CG as a shortcut, and it isn't that simple. Even though animation is filled with shortcuts, especially TV anime, you kind of have to do that when you're expected to put something out every week. It's the reason why helper studios are a thing, whether in the East or the West.
Yeah, because like I remember listening to like the director's commentary for Paranoia Agent. They actually talked about that with some of the hell that went on. Is Satoshi Kon had never done a series, but so when he was asked like, "All right, do we want to outsource the animation for some of these episodes to some other studios?" He said, "Oh no, it's just 12 episodes. We can handle that all in house." Look, I don't know how many people here listening to us actually sat down and like listened to that director's commentary. I don't know how Paranoia Agent ever finished. That was an absolute nightmare of a production, and that was kind of part of the reason why.
um, if you know anything about the story of Apocalypse Now, it's a miracle that ever finished.
I don't
Um,
know much of the backstory about that one, but I can understand.
or I suppose another example would be the island of Dr. Moreau. Both of them involving an out of shape Marlon Brando. Bit of a pattern there. But the point is that unless you really want to put in the money, it is harder to animate seinen, which I think is the reason why you see less seinen anime period, as opposed to shonen, which the shading techniques in shonen are significantly lighter, and I think that helps it when it comes to animation. It's easier to animate a lot of shonen battle manga for that reason.
Yeah, as for me, like one of the things I finally got around to watching was Classroom of the Elite season 2,
Mhm.
which I am surprised we finally got this season. When they talked about it the first time, or when there were some interviews done about season 2 anime, they basically just came out and said season 1 was just there to advertise the light novel and that there wasn't really plans to do more. I heard
Well,
people
that
theorize the light novel just wasn't doing too well, so like, all right, people really did like the anime. Let's go ahead and finally do a season 2.
well, I've heard I've heard my fair share of of stories about how a lot more anime than people think are used as glorified advertisements for either manga or light novels, and that's where the real money is at.
Like, I don't know enough about the business side to know how accurate that is, but that could be work.
I I know that you there was that instance where I think Toei or somebody else tried to get Cloudflare to shut down a manga piracy site, and even though the law that the studio was using doesn't have any weight when dealing with international
Yeah.
affairs. So they basically wanted them to enforce a Japanese law and in the process violate international law in pursuit of people breaking the law.
Yeah.
Um, Try and figure that out, preferably with a bottle of alcohol of your choice. But what was the gap between season one ending and season two starting?
I'd have to look it up, but like I know like 2019 is the first year where I did like I finally started watching enough anime for like a full top 10, and that was after Classroom of the Elite season. So I think it's been at least 4 or 5 years. Let me check just so we have an accurate number. 2017. So a good 5 years. Now I don't think that's the worst gap between seasons I've ever heard of, but it's notable.
It certainly is. One other series I was going to mention that I dipped into is I finally got off my ass and started watching The Witch from Mercury.
That is another one on my list I've not gotten to yet.
Uh,
It just seemed really weird from the stuff that people have been posting about it, but in a good way.
it is certainly a different take, but one thing that I do find interesting with the Witch from Mercury is there's a bit of a reversal of the usual relationship between Earth noids and space noids in that series. Usually the way it ends up working is people from space are being have dealt with repression from the Earth Federation government or its equivalent. In this case, it's the other way around. A lot of the government top downness is from space, and people from Earth are looked down on. Now, I will admit that that watching the prologue definitely helped put context into certain things. I'm not entirely sure if I'm still on the fence about about how necessary it is, but it certainly can't hurt. What I do think is interesting is the this it. I've seen some call this Gundam Otome, but one of the most popular Gundam series ever was created by someone who had a background in BL manga, so so striking a precedent. And this doesn't really come off as Otome anyways. There's not
Yeah.
there's not enough guys for this to be an Otome series. But I did forward the Witch from Mercury to my friend Claudio, the guy behind Knights of the Round Academy, because in both cases you have mecha meets full drama. But I'd say what's far more interesting is is the politics surrounding every student that's there, whether it be some students from Earth, or the fact that some folks seem to play real dirty, or the or this idea of Gundams being the product of a very dangerous technology that everyone wants banned. Also, as an aside, the titular Gundam in this one, Ariel, has a much better. I find to be a much more interesting use of drone slash funnel tech as opposed to the previous times where funnels have been used. The patient zero for the idea of funnel tech in Gundam is new, all the way back in Char's counterattack, and they mostly just hang around and shoot. That certainly is present with aerials, but there's a whole lot more that can be done.
I've always liked the idea of those kind of combat. But yeah, a lot of shows do kind of just use them for we're just gonna float around and it gets a little boring.
Like the options in a side scrolling shooter like Gradius.
Yeah. There's only one other show I watched this month that wasn't ADV related. I'll try to get those done just before we get into the main topic. Mm-hmm. This is one I think we both watched, Fudo PI.
Yep.
This is my first dive into anything Kamen Rider. This is a really good place to start because this show is fantastic. I like that they don't forget that these are private investigators. The series is basically set up in 3-episode acts where a problem's introduced, and rather than an episodic thing, it takes the full 3 episodes before the arc in general resolves. Any kind of action that's taking place during these episodes are basically teasers for the actual climax that's coming, which I very much appreciate. What were your thoughts on PI overall?
Well, obviously I have a more extensive background with Futo PI.
Yeah, because the live action was Kamen Rider Double?
Yeah.
That this is technically a sequel to? Well, I guess not technically. It is.
It is a direct follow up.
I will say, having not watched Double or knowing anything about it, I had no trouble following what was going on here. It doesn't expect you to have seen the live action to be able to.
That being said, having watched it does help put some things into context. I will admit it is a bit disappointing that they couldn't get any of the actors from Double to reprise their roles. But what is worth noting is both the original series and this were written by the same person, Riku Sanjo, who's one of my favorite screenwriters, and just a damn good writer. Period. Most of his stuff is in live action instead of in anime or manga, but he was responsible for Beat the Vandal Buster, which is probably the best Dragon Quest anime in all but name. But even without the original actors, which a lot of the reason that didn't happen is just they're all working on other projects. At least in one case, he has some issue with Toei and doesn't want to come back. But the sound-alikes that they have do a pretty good job.
I can't really compare to the original voices myself, but they all seem to nail the characters they're given in context to this. It's also one of the few anime where I can't really think of a character I don't like. I will say most of the cast are just kind of decent to really good, with a handful of characters that are fantastic. Philip and I wanted to call him Kotaro.
No, it's Shotaro.
Shotaro. It's I know Kotaro is not right. That was from something else I'd watched. But they're a fantastic pair. They actually feel like a pair of detectives. It's a pretty common trope that they go with, where you've got the more intuitive guy and then the really logically focused one. But it's a trope that works very well when done right. It's done very right here. Everyone feels natural interacting together. My only notable contention with the series is you kind of got your first arc set up like you would any kind of detective-esque story, or at least just the better ones, where you're kind of given all of the same information your investigators have. Maybe you haven't pieced everything together quite the way they did, but it's all kind of there. As the show goes on, that doesn't happen as much, which was a little bit of a letdown, specifically when you get into the alcohol guy, where the reveal comes in when you find out how this memory even functions, which you don't know until the reveal. So, unlike that first arc, you don't really have all the information. It's not a huge hit against the show, but it was something that did bother me a bit by that point.
It's important to remember that you're not just
Yeah.
dealing with a detective story, but a noir detective story.
Yeah.
And noir tends to use the whole thing of withholding the bulk of information.
Like, I think if it maybe did that more at the start, it's something that wouldn't have bothered me if, as time went on. But again, it's not a big detractor.
Yeah.
Like, it's still one of my probably my top 5 shows of the year so far. Great action beginning to end. I enjoy the cast, and I'm excited for season 2 when that inevitably comes out.
I do remember somebody complaining about some of the fan servicey moments with Tokime, but given how Tokime is kind of meant to be the femme fatale in this
Yeah.
particular story.
Look, I've determined what makes me enjoy fan service are one of 2 things. Like, what? These 2 things generally need to be true for me. Is it so out of place and distracting that it's taking away from what's going on? In this case, no. And 2, how much do I like this character? The more I like him, the more I tend to appreciate the fan service.
And it is hard to hate Tokime, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, she's great.
Uh,
Like, again, it's another little cliche you see fairly often where the reason her and Philip don't get along at first is basically they don't like each other for the exact same reason, and they don't seem to realize it.
Well, the big problem is that the two of them are kind of similar folk in the fact that they have very bad people skills.
Yeah.
Well, Philip can have people skills when it involves something that actually interests him, but
Yeah.
remember he has the entire planet's information on it in his head.
See, I'm actually expecting for how they left off for season 2 to kind of go a bit more into detail into the past events. So I think the anime is going to be explaining some of what happened with Kamen Rider Double.
As far as just explaining the events of Double, I'd be okay if they did that for like an episode, maybe 2 of them.
I'm not expecting it to be a whole, like, that's kind of what I'm thinking will happen, is like an episode or 2 before diving back into the plot going on. It's interesting. Like, I like the whole idea of Shadow Fudo in this dark city.
Yeah, Shadow Futo is definitely one of those. Something that I appreciate is that there's a lot of shots and the like that are very clearly things that they could not have done in live action. Shadow Futo is one of those things that you couldn't do live action, or if you could, it would be very expensive.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes with a lot of the Dopant designs in the anime. A big example would be Road.
Like, I like that they're actually making good use of the fact it's animation now. But yeah, other than that, like, I don't have too much more to say that wouldn't be spoiling about Fudo PI. It's just a fantastic show. Don't feel intimidated jumping in if you're unfamiliar with Kamen Rider.
One thing I will say, Aurora looks like a JoJo character.
You're not wrong. I did not think about that until you mentioned it.
Also, for whatever reason, I should note that the gag at the end with the healing Princess Neo was a nice little in joke, especially since the guest always ends up being Terui, which his particular catchphrase is one that people have had a difficult amount of time translating, because in some of the original fan subs it was "I don't take questions," but "Do not question me" is close enough.
Yeah, other than that, again, from here on out, I've just watched a lot of old ADV stuff. Like, one of the first things I checked out just because, well, I've been looking for an excuse to sit down and watch this for a while now because I've been a bit busy. But Gunsmith Cats. I don't know how I've taken this long to watch this show. This feels like an absolute love letter to a lot of 80s American action movies written by a guy from Japan.
Well, the guy behind Gunsmith Cats is a bona fide gun nut.
I never would have guessed.
Which is probably why there's the insistence on having that amount of detail with the firearms that you see.
Yeah. I mean, for Christ's sakes, one of the villain's plans is gun control. Like, any kind of restriction to these characters' firearms is painted as coming from the bad guys. Now, that said, I wouldn't call this, like, pro-gun necessarily, just because, again, it's kind of got that vibe of your 80s action. It's more anything that's going to get in the way or inhibit the action or the awesome of what's going on is the bad guy.
But I will admit that I have had my laughs when it comes to May Hopkins' attitude about grenades. That being many.
Yes. I also kind of miss I know this was released in the States in 92, but this still feels like an 80s action anime. And just its brazen love of just finding ways to strip off clothes in some way, no matter how ridiculous it is. Like hooking someone's shirt off with a crane. I love it.
Well, I've one of the punish the short guy moments that I've put up with was hanging them up on a on the hook on the door.
That's how one of my friend's dad punished him when he was being annoying. He hung him up on it. Apparently, though, he forgot he did it, but they had a house big enough that he couldn't hear his kid, so he was up there until his mother got home.
Yeah.
But yes, like from what I understand, like the manga, apparently the story gets a bit more serious, relatively speaking. Anyway, this isn't really a very deep movie by any stretch. It's
no,
a lot of action, pretty ladies, and explosions. It knows what it wants.
In that regard, you could jokingly call it Black Lagoon without the psychosis. But that's a bit of a stretch, but work with me here.
Yeah. Now, one of the others I watched, this became one of the weirdest movies I've ever tried to write a review on. Dirty Pair Project Eden. I love this movie, but it almost I want to say it almost doesn't care about anything outside of what it wants to be. But it doesn't care to the point it almost feels like it's defying you to think about this movie. I mean, there's this whole thing about the government of this one planet being really secretive, but also anti-capitalist. And they're holding these secret experiments to handle all this new refining technology. Yeah, that has nothing to do with anything going on. It's introduced at one point, but the movie obviously doesn't care.
That checks out for a Dirty Pair movie.
I didn't see the series, so I don't know if this is a faithful adaptation of what to expect in the series. But even come movie's end, does anybody really win? The only guy who comes out of this winning is a dude who was there for reasons that had nothing to do with the actual plot. This reviving these alien races to become the successors to humanity, he wasn't there for any of that shit. Everything's probably worse because the Dirty Pair got involved. The villain clearly didn't win by the end because he's just crazy and barely has any idea of what he's doing. I love almost every moment of this movie. It's how would I even review the climax, which it's an 80s hair ballad music video at that point. And I review shows and games, not 80s hair metal music videos. If you're at all interested in this, and having no bearskin fan service, don't watch this movie because for reasons I still don't understand, the aliens suddenly have ass and tits by the end of it, when they didn't at the beginning. So yeah, I had no idea how to actually go about reviewing this thing, except that I absolutely am going to have to watch the actual series now.
Yeah, if I knew you were diving into Dirty Pair, I would have trying to do some deep analysis of Dirty Pair would have been
pointless.
Would have been DOA. Because that is a series that dares you to take it seriously because it knows it's not happening.
I know. I love it. Again, it's not like with Gunsmith Cats. It's this movie almost hates you for trying to take it seriously. Like, it's mocking somebody out there that I don't know who this person is, but it feels like it's telling someone to go fuck themselves.
Probably somebody at CBR.
They knew it was coming one day. This preemptively made this.
Yeah, or Giga for that matter.
There were two other ADV stuff I watched. I almost said films for both, but the first was I did finally watch Devil Hunter Yoko. We'll get into this a bit once we start, but I understand why this kind of took off and helped them get a foothold, because it was those early days of anime. Like, people weren't seeing stuff like this. I don't think that as a show it's very good. It's not.
It is important. It is important to note that Devil Hunter Yoko was one of their first pieces.
Oh yeah, like, for a first outing, like, I think the dubbing was fine. Nothing great. Early 90s anime dubs. But you get like bits where it's the kind of animation where there's a lot of times one thing will be happening and then immediately in the next couple frames you're like, that person shouldn't be there able to do what they are doing. Like, the continuity of the action very poor throughout this, and it is very obvious. Like, there's definitely worse shows out there. It's just kind of overall not, and in not very interesting ways to talk about. Except I do love The Grandmother. Other than that, it was just Puni Puni Puemi I actually rewatched.
So that's the reason you dropped that earlier.
Yeah, like, the thing is, I remember the first time watching it years ago. Like, this is the only one of these I have seen before, and I don't know if I'm going to get a chance to bring this bit up again. The actual hardcover DVD came with the sad story of how Puni Puni Puemi was. It is the half-fictional story of the behind-the-scenes of this show. Like, I obviously won't sit here and read this entire pamphlet because it's lengthy. But just some worthwhile quotes from this when they talked about getting in touch with Nabashin, the director for Excel Saga, to come back to direct this. If he was going to act, it had to be now. Producer Kitayama made a call to Nabashin, aka director Shinichi Watanabe. This was where the mistake started. Or at one point, when again referring to Nabashin, to put it positively, he was a go-by-the-feel-of-it type. To put it negatively, he had an irresponsible personality.
Yeah, that checks out.
It's like, and this is a joke that a lot of people who probably watched the English dub entirely missed. But you'll notice, like, if you've seen an English dub, the whole time, Puemi's referring to herself in the third person as Kobayashi, which is a little weird at first, until you realize, like, the joke is supposed to be like the main character wants to be a voice actor, but she's really, really bad at it. So the Japanese voice actor, to kind of make the joke work, referred to herself in the third person when voicing Puemi. But for some reason, when they did the English dub, she still uses like the Japanese voice actress's name rather than her own. It's one of those things, I don't know why that wasn't changed for the English dub, because it probably would have made more sense.
Of course, you're talking about sense and Nabeshin in the same sentence.
Well, I don't think Nabeshin made the choice for the American voice actress to still use Kobayashi.
I look at this as a consequence of the Wild West that was early dubbing.
Yeah. But no, like, this entire pamphlet just reads like that. Like, everyone involved with this show is made to look bad to at least some degree. Which makes me think, like, okay, yeah, they were probably all in on the joke. Everyone probably realized how bad this show was by the time they finally put it out. Because they basically straight up said, look, we had a vague idea for a show that would kind of match with the Puni Puni Puemi thing that was in Excel Saga. But they brought everyone in without really having an idea of what they wanted to do. And they just assumed that because the guy who wrote it, was it a guy? Well, I don't know if it was a guy or a girl, but was the same person who wrote Trigun. Like, okay, I know we don't have the best idea, but they'll be able to weave a lot of these random things we want to do together to make this work. No? So there's an acceptance of the entire crew that this was just not a good project. So they just kind of did what they could with it, had some fun, and made this little pamphlet to go with the show. And it is way funnier than even the show is on that second watch. The only other thing I'll really say about the show is I did not catch this joke the first time because JoJo's wasn't really much of a thing back when Puni Puni came out in the States. At least not unless you were like looking up all the online manga translations where you had Diamond is not Crash. But yeah, just the villain of the show randomly calls out a stand that is obviously Star Platinum. Like, it's not a visual parody of Star Platinum, it's just Star Platinum. To which Nabashin responds, "It looks like we're about to have a standoff." It's. I have to wonder how many people actually got that joke when the show first came out here. That pretty much wraps up everything I've been watching the past month. Anything else you've gotten into?
Um, obviously there's the fact that I on a bit of a whim, I decided to read some hidden gems in my own library. I decided to look at the original record of Lodos War, which still mostly holds up, but there is a whole lot of cheating you have to deal with. If you're familiar with 90s anime, then you should know what I mean when I talk about cheating. But it is certainly all right. Um, it is kind of funny that people call Record of Lodos War anime D&D. That's not the entire truth. If there's anything that is anime D&D, although not using D&D's magic system, which makes it better, it's probably Slayers. The analogy I've always used is Slayers is your D&D campaigns when you're in high school. Orphan is your D&D campaigns when you're in college. And Sorcerer Hunters is your D&D campaign if you were an idiot. And Record of Lodos War is your D&D is you being nostalgic for your D&D campaigns once you're out of college. Or this romanticized idea of your campaigns that you were running in high school. That's the best way to describe it.
Lotus War has some weird anime attached to it, like Soldier. Just like, why is this part? How is this happening in the same universe?
I can actually explain that. Lodos. Here's the thing to keep in mind. While Lodos had its roots in a D&D replay that was in Comptique magazine, it would gradually form what would become Alecrast, which was the campaign setting for the first edition of Sword World. And Rune Soldier takes place in that same Alecrast area, although a different region in it. Obviously not taking place on Lodos, but it's still the same universe. Same thing goes for Cristania. They were all integrated into Sword World. Even if Louis the Rune Soldier comes off like a fantasy crackfic.
It's a good way to put it.
But to be fair, one of my favorite fantasy authors is Terry Pratchett, and Discworld is the picture boy for a crackfic.
All right, so with all that out of the way, I guess it's time to actually get into ADV Films. Now, as mentioned a bit ago, like, we might as well start where ADV Films themselves really started, and that was Devil Hunter Yoko.
If we really want to go into their origins, then we have to talk about Blue Seed, because that was their first. But that was technically the first one that ADV Films had handled, to the point where I remember my first introduction to it was VHS tapes of it.
Now, was they're just a studio that worked on it? Because, like, if I remember, I think when ADV Films basically became its own publisher and distributors when they did, wow, I just said the name of the show, Devil Hunter Yoko. Like, before that, were they just basically, like, working on other projects with other companies?
Yeah, they were in the same position that Animiego was in. They were just a distributor.
Okay, so I had it the other way around. I thought they went into the distribution with Devil Hunt.
No, they already had a few things under their belt, but something else to keep in mind is this was still during the golden age of VHS, and the demand for more stuff on VHS shelves, especially with the advent of rental stores, everybody wanted to get in on that. Yeah. And even more so with the boom of OVAs and the home video effect over in Japan.
Just like to briefly talk about the OVAs in general. Anime in Japan, maybe this is just a Japanese thing too, like, the OVAs almost have, like, the opposite view of your direct to DVD movies over here in the States, even in terms of just the anime, where if it's not getting the TV series and it's not getting a theatrical release, a lot of our media kind of had the stigma of, well, this is about the only way we can really release it because it wasn't good enough to go elsewhere. This is not true with anime OVAs. Like, you would see a lot of the times much higher animation qualities than you would for any of your TV releases.
You want to know the patient zero for the whole thing when it came to OVAs is?
Which one?
Megazone 23.
That one I don't know too much about.
Now, I'm not gonna sit here and say that Megazone 23 is good. It is all right, but it is important historically. And the big reason for that is this was a Megazone 23 was supposed to be a full on series, but midway through, production issues happened and they couldn't finish the series. So somebody decided, fuck it, let's just release what we've got. Because of the fact that it wasn't a finished series, obviously they couldn't put it on television, so they decided to put it direct to video. They didn't expect it to be successful. So when it hit and it hit big, it showed the viability of this whole direct to video thing instead of doing TV or film. Especially since in Japan, studios own the theaters. That doesn't happen in the States because we have antitrust laws that prevent it. But that's not the case over there.
Yeah, I do bring that up because I kind of fell into that category of people who just assumed, oh, OVAs, it's probably going to be like our direct to DVD. And because of that, a lot of people, even who were getting into anime from like the series and whatnot that were coming out, completely missed a lot of these things that were coming out because of an unfair Western stigma.
Around the time that stuff like Blue Seed and Devil Hunter Yoko and Miyuki-chan and Wonderland were coming about, anime that wasn't DBZ was looked at as fringe.
Yeah. That said, there's a definite market that did build up because people were checking out these random OVAs like, again, Devil Hunter Yoko, Blue Seed, Megazone as it seems.
Blue Seed wasn't an OVA, but it was ADV's first major project. This was still around the time where the idea of a specific anime spot in a video store, whether rental or otherwise, or even in libraries, wasn't a thing. A lot of this stuff was still under the umbrella of animation because there's still this whole animation as a genre shit that I'm not a fan of. A lot of the stuff that ADV was putting out, even in those early days, was certainly not in that vibe. Especially since there's still the kid stuff problem that animation suffered and still suffers. As a bit of an aside, Miyuki-chan in Wonderland is fucking weird. even for something that's supposed to be a spin on Alice in Wonderland, which if you've seen any adaptation of Alice in Wonderland, you should be expecting weird shit. Even by those standards, it's weird, and I can't help but wonder if it's the one entry from Clamp that Clamp doesn't want to talk about.
ADV, when they really did start to take off there in the early 90s, like as their own entity in and of themselves, I think they kind of hit at a perfect time.
Well, the thing that helped them the most to hit was getting their hands on Evangelion.
Yeah, when they really took off. But even just getting their foothold, like, you started seeing more and more companies pop up after the success of Akira here in the West, which I believe does predate ADV.
I'd say so, but in my not so humble opinion, ADV didn't really start to break out into their own until the early 2000s.
Yeah. Well, definitely. But
some of that was helped by the DVD boom in 2001. And that's not to say they weren't doing anything up until that point. It's just that they were doing a whole lot more by the time that came around.
Yeah. I was just bringing up the bit with Akira just because that is kind of where a lot of people started seeing or at least over here in the West, for animation that could be just graphic, violent, not just for kids stuff. And that you could start getting more of that by importing stuff from Japan. So you started seeing more of just these violent, bloodier shows start cropping up. And it's kind of, as hype for that was building, ADV was releasing stuff like their Devil Hunter Yoko, which wasn't like anything else we were getting.
Mhm.
So I think just them coming out on their own at that time probably did a lot to just solidify them or give them the grounding they needed to eventually start to blow up.
I'd say it's more of
Yeah.
giving the grounding because, as the saying goes, Rome wasn't built in a day.
Yeah.
And I have a soft spot for a lot of the dub work that ADV did. I will admit I'm in the minority, and I know some people got their start with more recent stuff, can't handle the voice direction, but I have my fondness for it.
I think they definitely did some good stuff.
One of my favorite parodies of Mecha is Martian Successor Nadesco, which was under their umbrella.
Yeah. I saw the first half of that show. My friend who owned it left. I have yet to finish it. I need to.
It second half has its issues, but I don't want to spoil too much on that front.
Oh yeah. I've somehow managed to avoid hearing anything about it for over a decade.
Now, I have my biases, and I can't bring up ADV without bringing up Orphan and bringing up Cartoon Boy. Oh, but or is still one of my favorite fantasy anime, and a good amount of that is due to the dub work because when I had the opportunity, I did try and listen to the sub version of Orphan, and everybody's voice is just way too high up. Orphan himself sounds like the direction given was to do a Goku-like voice.
Huh.
If you've seen any bit of Orphan or seen how that character is meant to work,
Very little, but yeah.
yeah, but doing a Goku like kid voice for that character didn't make any sense. By the early 2000s, you had a three-way fight going on between ADV, Viz, and Bandai. And Funimation was down there in the bottom, but most people only knew Funimation as the people who were handling the distribution of 4Kids' shit. Or
We will get into them another day.
yeah, I got some words to say about the guy who was running that house.
Think like what? Only two of them are still around. Viz Media, Funimation.
Yeah, I have no desire to do a retrospective on Funimation. The early 2000s were an interesting time to be an anime fan, just given the sheer amount of stuff that started to come out because with three companies trying to put out as much material as they could to keep up with the rental store demand, there was no shortage of stuff that was coming out, and of course that had a ripple effect. I mean, through things like Adult Swim, which was building on the momentum of Toonami. Now, there had been anime-focused magazines in the past. The big one that comes to mind is Anime Insider, but a lot of them didn't exactly have what you would call production value.
Whereas New Type, that was a detailed magazine.
Well, it was not only that. It was a big ass magazine.
Yeah.
It was not trying to do the 8.5 by 11 standard. New Type USA had a whole lot of promotional images from various anime projects. They putting out a bunch of different posters and the like, and a preview DVD of stuff that they had acquired, along with doing just a bunch of stuff. Period, including I distinctly remember them doing segments of episode guides of anime that were going on in Japan, which during the height of Yu-Gi-Oh, I was able to use to act as spoiler for events because let's not forget I am a bastard. But I distinctly recall several of those previews that they had. It'd be cheeky to say that, oh, not cheeky. It would be easy to say that a one episode preview of an anime is just a glorified advertisement. But fuck me if it didn't work because that's how I got introduced to a few different anime. It's how I got introduced to Sakura Wars because it would be a few years before we'd actually get a Sakura Wars game in English, and I've never been a fan of the hoops I had to go through to import.
Now, I think something worth bringing up about now, just because a lot of people who are like getting into anime and somewhat recently, or like even as far back as like the noughties, stupid as it is to call a decade the noughties. The way people generally found out about new anime was really scarce because you didn't see anime advertising on TV. You had what they might have been putting out on Toonami, Adult Swim. So the way a lot of people were finding out were one of two main methods. You had things like, of course, New Type USA, which again, they're glorified advertisements of their own stuff and other things. And the lost art of the preview that came on DVDs, like, or VHS. Like, you'd buy the VHS of an anime, plug it in, and before the stuff would even start, it'd be like when you go to a movie. You see the advertisements and trailers for other stuff that studio or publisher are working on.
And hell, with a lot of their releases in the VHS days, they had this thing of putting out a bunch of little trailers for different works before you got to the feature presentation.
Yeah.
There were a handful of anime I can think of where I end up getting intrigued by them through those trailers. There's a bunch of names that can come to mind, but a few that can come off the top of my head: Getter Robo Armageddon, Gasaraki, AD Police, Sin is interesting in hindsight, Generator Gaul, and as well as Legend of Crystania, which is a sequel of sorts to Record of Lodoss War. It's also how I first found out about Nadia, the Secret of Blue Water, which is a story in and of itself, and we kind of covered that when on Geek Watch when we talked about Gynax.
One reason I did bring that up is it's one of those weird things, like when you talk to like the geeks of a certain era of anime, like so far back, you get something you don't get as often these days, and that's like a lot of them seem to have like circulated around like the same handful of OVAs and series. Like, clearly a lot of them would see other things and more, but I think that had a lot to do with how they were finding out, because everyone had to find out about the anime from the same spots basically.
And it's also important to note that even though internet was starting to become more available, it wouldn't be until the tail end of the aughts that internet would become ubiquitous.
Yeah.
Like around that time, the only time I had access to the internet was through library.
Yeah, but yeah, you get to like anime fans now, there's just so much information just coming from all kinds of different places. You could have a person who's seen so many different animes and another person seeing just as many, and there'd be like no crossover at all. Something you didn't really see as often back in the day. And certainly not to the extent.
Even with all that, it is still very easy to spot somebody who is an actual anime fan and who's a poser.
Yeah.
People always talk about how much things have changed from the early days. Some things have not changed, and being able to spot a poser, or even a poser within fans, the methods to detect bullshit have not changed and will not change.
Indeed.
And I say poser within a fan base because you and I have seen. Stop me if you've heard this particular story before. I'm not a fan of mecha, except for Gundam Wing, Evangelion, and Gurren Lagann.
Except for the short list of some of the most popular ones outside of Japan.
One thing that ADV was instrumental for that I don't think they get enough credit for is helping to bring soundtracks to these states. I know I mentioned it in the Gynax episode, but something to consider is what really helped keep anime alive, especially in the early 70s, and where anime was starting to really lose ground to tokusatsu, especially with the creation of Kamen Rider, is focusing less on toys and more on model kits, as well as getting deals with music company. That's also the reason why you started having a lot of pop songs in anime, and just more elaborate orchestra pieces. One of the big examples being Macross Plus getting a hold of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra. I will note that I had a bit of a habit, especially when Suncoast was still around, of grabbing every soundtrack that I could. That was how I found out about Lost Universe.
Because like even in the West, you didn't really see shows releasing soundtracks.
No,
It happened with certain movies where the soundtrack was like a couple songs that maybe played during the movie and a handful of pop songs that were hits that had nothing to do with the movie.
there is the habit of that insert song for a given movie. That's usually a case of you do me a favor, I'll do you a favor.
Yeah, I do remember seeing like a lot of soundtracks for anime, even like just back in the day before anime just in general has always been really good at merchandising itself.
Well, it kind of had. I know a lot of people
Yeah.
hate to admit this, but it kind of had to be
Yeah.
because again, in the in the early 70s, anime was on death's door.
Had to make income off the audience you had, and you couldn't just like jack up the prices of what you're already selling because that's a very quick way to turn your audience away from you.
Have you ever seen the film Other People's Money?
I don't think so.
In that film, there's a infamous buggy whip speech from Danny DeVito's character where he talks about the quickest way to go broke is an increased share in a shrinking market.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
First off, if they had increased the price, it'd be the case of, well, what would be the point? Because all of these particular anime would be on television.
Yeah.
There is one other avenue that I think certainly helped, even if the audience for it wasn't as wide. In the early 2000s, a lot of one particular trend that a lot of cable and satellite providers were really getting in on was on demand, which could be considered a natural evolution of the pay-per-view infrastructure that had been a thing since the death of closed circuit television. And where this comes into play with ADV is their own take on the concept with the anime network.
I saw so many advertisements for that thing, but I never actually had a chance to subscribe to it live.
I had a friend subscribe to it because around that time, myself and a few friends operated a trading circle between each other, where one of us would say a given anime, and we would distribute it among each other for a few days before putting it back into the cycle. Or in some cases, I would tape the programming block for Adult Swim one week and then give that to everybody else. And it wasn't like we were a bunch of super geniuses or something like that. It was a case of necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
Because one of us had Anime Network, the others didn't. I had access to Adult Swim, the others didn't. And one of us knew how to get fan subs off of the usual spots, and the others didn't. So I have a shit ton that I'm looking at right now of those CDR and RW CDs, which I really should open one of these days because there are a bunch of different anime that I was exposed to through that method that I would later see on through ADV or other places. It is kind of amusing that with all that expansion, ADV never tried dipping their toe into games. I get the feeling that the reason they didn't is because that would have been a very costly endeavor, and they're always trying to keep things on a lower price range if they could.
Yeah, and games are not cheap to do.
No,
And
even
ADV did work on one game. You may be asking yourself, well, what game is that? And you probably already now realize why it is this only happened once. But it is Unlimited Saga. I don't know exactly what they did on Unlimited Saga. But
I think lending out voice talent. I know that Vic had mentioned that that in studio it was called Unlimited Crap. I don't hate Unlimited Saga as much as some folks do.
never played it.
I have. I think I still have it in the back. But Unlimited Saga was very bad at explaining itself. The early spots of it had a whole lot of hand braking, which is all the more problematic when you deal with the fact that the Saga series does not play things traditional, since Romancing Saga, and this especially applies to the Saga Frontier games on the PS1 that have a bit more in common with Live a Live in terms of doing unorthodox methods when it comes to their mechanics, which is why Unlimited Saga being bad at explaining itself is a problem, even more so than you.
But yeah, if anyone's wondering why they didn't dip into games more often, that was their first time, and they probably went, yeah, we're done here.
funny thing is, one of the big selling points with Unlimited Saga was having a preview of 10-2, because this was still during that time where you'd sell certain games by putting previews or demos of bigger titles. Something to really keep in mind is that because of how non-seriously the international market was treated, the fact that it was I think outside union work. You would grab anybody who was able to work on the cheap, and you couldn't be picky about their talents, which is why you have some questionable voice acting and voice direction in a lot of those early days of dubbing.
Yeah. Sometimes it came together and was very good, but there's some weird ones out there.
For
There's
every,
Love
for
Hina.
every I have I will admit Love Hina is a guilty pleasure, and I have a appreciation for what Ken Akamatsu is doing lately, especially with his push towards game preservation, which is an important issue for me, obviously,
Yeah.
as a both as the gaming monk and as a historian. There wasn't any one big thing that led to ADV's downfall. It was a death by a thousand cuts thing. I do think that focusing so much on the anime network, that must have been far more costly than a lot of people maybe realized.
Yeah.
With the ubiquitousness that was gradually developing when it came to the internet, you started to enter a phase where it became easier and easier to get a hold of fan subs,
Yeah.
and fan subs will always be able to get out faster than DVDs. Something that doesn't exactly help matters is, I distinctly remember how absolutely ridiculously expensive a full season's worth of DVDs was at that time.
I don't know if there has ever been one as bad as this, but the DVDs for Fooly Cooly can go fuck themselves.
Um,
It's like
even
$60 for 2 episodes. It was
let me
ridiculous.
let me raise you one. The DVD collection. I distinctly remember every time I would go into a Suncoast or a Best Buy, there would be that big ass DVD collection for Gundam Wing of 10 discs, which would run you between $200 and $250. And even something like the complete series for Nadesco, which was this big ass DVD case. That
Yeah.
cost me 100. That cost me 110.
At least that's a
The,
full series. Like, you're spending $60 for 2 episodes of Fooly Cooly. It's $180 for all 6 episodes. But yeah, it got bad. So
yeah,
bad.
I consider it fortunate that these days you can get a full season of an anime or the like for around $30. 40 if you want, 40 or 50 if you want to go fancy, which for some collectors that's going to be a viable option. But and granted, there's certain anime that are absolute must watches that are near impossible to get a hold of these days, like the Rurouni Kenshin OVAs or Karas. I can't even find a decent. The closest thing I could find is some French releases, and those would have run me $100 each. And Karas is only 6 episodes.
Yeah, like, before we get too much into the actual downfall of ADV,
Mhm.
like, one thing I do want to bring up they did quite a bit of as time went on that you don't really see happen anymore is the redub.
Yeah, I'd say one of the big examples of them doing of a redub was Akira. I think a lot of people who are going to be watching Akira when we were growing up and now were probably watching the redub in the 2000s instead of the original 80s dub.
Like, I know with a
And
lot of their redubs, it was redubbing stuff usually where a lot of stuff was getting cut for just a Western release. So when they'd redub it, they'd keep back in more of the blood and whatnot. They'd keep the script a lot closer, even if it was like darker. And they were basically treating it more like animation was intended for adults rather than some of the original dubs, which tried to make stuff more kid friendly.
yeah, I liken that to the fact that the kid stuff stigma had
Yeah.
started to recede a bit. And this is one of the blessings and the curses of the impact that South Park had, as well as Shrek. Both are projects that I have a complicated attitude about. That's the best way for me to put it. Just complicated. But I do think I do think one of around that same time, I remember that that Four Kids was trying to do these uncut versions of some of their work, but but they only did like one volume each of at least two shows, Yu-Gi-Oh and Shaman King. I think there was I think there was an uncut version of one. No, there wasn't an uncut version of One Piece. We wouldn't start getting that until years later when Funimation was trying to undo all the damage.
That's why I originally stopped watching One Piece, as I'd seen the Four Kids version first.
Uh, but that's the version
Yeah.
that's the version that we all had seen.
Yeah.
But I slightly take it back because I do remember seeing advertisements of DBZ uncut
Yeah.
around that time, uh, which is ironic given some of the edits that Kai would do some years later. But if you had to guess, which do you suppose was a more costly endeavor? New Type USA or the Anime Network?
Ooh. Like, I'd almost have to say the Anime Network, but that feels like one of those gotchas where obviously there is something up with New Type, because DVD releases with the magazines, the far bigger magazines, the normal had to be more costly to do.
I honestly feel like I don't have a right answer because obviously I don't know, but I can't help but suspect that New Type USA was significantly more expensive. The big reason I say that is obviously the cost of doing and distributing print media, especially as this print media was not going to be on. You weren't going to find New Type USA on the magazine rack at a grocery store, if you follow me.
Oh yeah.
More often than not, I'd see it at Suncoast or Barnes and Noble or Borders or sometimes Walden Books. The rare times I would walk into Walden.
I saw some
Yeah,
at Target once.
I was spoiled for choice when it came to bookstores growing up.
Yeah.
Which might explain a few things, but I do recall that New Type USA instead of most magazines would run for about $10, sometimes as little as 8 if you're dealing with bigger publications. New Type USA ran for $13. That's the reason why I say it may have been a more costly endeavor, because the amount of production value that they were putting in, as well as all the extra stuff, and the fact that unlike other magazines, it had to be put in its own little bag, probably ran things up.
Yeah.
But
Nothing they did could have been all that cheap.
the other thing that I'd imagine did not help matters is as time went on, other companies started on the dubbing thing. I already mentioned Viz and Bandai. There is one other company I'm not sure if I mentioned, and that is Pioneer. Well, they were known as Pioneer originally, and then they would retitle themselves Geneon. There did seem to be a working relationship with Geneon for a while before that fell apart. As time went on, they were starting to get more and more of the share because they were able to get a more direct line. Viz had the foothold as the distributors of Jump.
Yeah. That's a big one right there.
It wasn't like there was one big scandal that they couldn't recover from. No, ADV's death was a death by 1,000 cuts, which tends to happen with pioneers in any medium.
Just looking over a lot of the stuff they were releasing, like, while people do have fond memories of like a lot of the weird early stuff and some of their really big hits, this is just like a list of almost just kind of okay anime.
There was certainly a lot lot of that, because they came from the strategy of grab whatever you can.
That started to bite.
Especially since again Bandai US and Geneon had a far more direct line, so they could afford to be more selective.
I'm looking at 2014. They released about 14 different anime this year. That's a lot of product for just like the one studio in 2004. And that's just looking at the series. Like, I haven't looked at like the movies they were trying to do or the specials or the OVAs. That was just the series.
By the time 2014 comes around, were you saying 2014 or
2004.
Yeah, you got to be consistent on that front.
Yeah, yeah, 2004.
Yeah, 2004. By that point, the multi-front war between multiple studios had entered full blast. other anime focused blocks were starting to make their appearance. This was where you started to have Pioneer working with G4 Tech TV, which did help introduce a few interesting works to other people through Pioneer's days. Stuff like Gatekeepers 23, Last Exile, and Monster, as well as Gungrave, which has been my gold standard when it comes to adapting a video game into an anime. One thing I do recall is after New Type had fizzled out, they tried to relaunch it in the form of a magazine called Peak, spelled PIQ. It was supposed to be a general weeb culture thing instead of one that was anime focused. It only lasted one issue.
Is it possible because they gave it a stupid name?
I think the idea for the name was built on the whole idea of something to pique your interest. I think the reason why it didn't work was just because a wider direction when you had already done 2 years worth of focusing on anime with this magazine. That's one hell of a shift, and not enough people are going to jump on that, especially since the way most magazines make their money is through subscription. I'm trying to think if there was any one release that they tried to get that backfired, and the only one that comes to mind is that infamous ad for Gurren Lagann.
Did it ever come out why they ended up losing the publishing for Gurren Lagann?
I've never been given an answer as to why. I do not think it had anything to do with that trailer. I think it was just the fact that, again, Bandai was going to have a more direct line.
I wish I remembered to save some of the links, but I did find a bunch of like old blog posts from like around the time where ADV was basically shut down, sold off all their rights, with a lot of different people like talking about what was going on. Not like real insider information, but just how it was looking at time. They had a lot of stuff they were licensed and planning to push out at the time. You know, it's kind of like how I pointed out for that 2004 year. There was a lot on the table for one company. It still looked like that at that time. They just dumped a bunch of money into a live-action Evangelion movie that just fizzled out. Following
the idea of them doing a of anybody doing a live action Evangelion, unless you're willing to spend a ridiculous amount of money, is DOA.
Yeah. Like, I don't know how much money they were putting towards it, but it couldn't have been a small amount.
I mean, hell, Harmony Gold has been trying to get a live action Robotech off the ground for almost 20 years now.
Man, I think it kind of became obvious with time that the anime network wasn't going to be a success. So it was just like
it had its moment of success, but the on-demand model was starting to fizzle out.
So it's just like all these different things were kind of just crashing in on them as they were trying to release Gurren Lagann, essentially. So I don't think like the original creators and Japanese studios were trying to screw over ADV or anything, or did anything underhanded. They just went, oh wow, this company's done. Like, they've passed the point of no return by then. So kind of last minute, I think they had to make the call. Like a lot of other anime studios apparently were also doing at the time, because nothing they were planning to release at that point was obviously going to happen. So just everyone just pulled out at once because it was a sinking ship by then.
The other thing that's interesting is around that time they tried to split things off into subdivisions, with their more art house division being Sentai Studios, Sentai has kind of become the reincarnation of ADV, especially when you consider some of the stuff that they put out. The other thing that is a bit of a reincarnation is Retro Crush.
Retro Crush, I'm not really familiar.
Retro Crush is a anime streaming platform that focuses primarily in older works. I think the most recent they get is the early 2000s, and a lot of the stuff that they have is stuff that fell through the cracks. Like some of the things I've seen on there is stuff like GTO and the original Fist of the North Star anime.
So some good stuff apparently.
It is some good stuff, but they know it's designed to be a nostalgia trip. I think they just grabbed all the stuff that Tokyo Pop had in limbo when they went belly up. And I wanted to bring up the whole reincarnation thing, because even though ADV went belly up in the way that they did, the idea of of a distributor that was covering lesser known stuff, basically a glorified indie, was something that died with it. In fact, I distinctly remember saying around that time that somebody was going to pick up that mantle, and once again, I end up being right. I know some might bring up G Kids, but G Kids is the criterion of anime distribution. The stuff that G Kids does is could be described as the anime you can show to your parents. You know, the art house shit. I had completely forgotten about that live action attempt. I
Yeah.
can't help but wonder if the reason that was even made an announcement is I do remember around that time there was heavy amounts of talk of doing a adaptation of Akira in live action, which that's also something that's been in development hell for over a decade.
Just let it die.
And I know that there was also talk. I know that there was also talk of Keanu Reeves wanting to do a live action Bebop. And truth be told, I'd like to see what that alternate universe would have looked like if he actually went through with it. I mean, the concept's ridiculous
Yeah.
now, but in the wake of John
Yeah.
Wick, is the concept all that ridiculous?
I think he could do the action. I don't know if I could see him playing any other aspect of Spike.
I don't even know if he had planned on playing Spike.
Uh,
I think he was mostly going to be producing.
huh.
Take that with a grain of salt, though. But hey, it couldn't have been fucking worse than what we got. The other thing is that I think is amusing in hindsight, given what's been going on lately within some scenes, is instead of being headquartered in the LA area, it was headquartered in Texas. When certainly a bold move to stick in Texas at that time, when all the voice acting stuff was going on in the LA area, much to its detriment because it's Los Angeles. The thing is that I say interesting in hindsight because we've been seeing a bunch of businesses move over to Texas or just move out of the coastal cities. A big example is Louis Rossman moving his business over to Texas just
Ooh.
because he was sick of all the bullshit going on in New York. Something else I think to note is just the way ADV did things was going to work perfectly fine during a time frame when anime was still an underground thing. Once anime started getting more and more of a foothold internationally, what they were doing wasn't going to work as well anymore. It's also the same reason U.S. manga core was always going to have a short shelf life. And while U.S. manga core was an absolute trash fire here in the States, they had a much bigger foothold in the UK. Of course, there's also manga entertainment who the 2000s were not kind to manga entertainment. They could barely get anything.
2000s weren't kind to a fair few of those really old studios.
Oh, a lot of things changed a lot of fast, and not everybody could keep up.
Sadly, one of those was ADV. Like, I think if they started tweaking their business model once like those 2000s started hitting, we might still see ADV films around today, but it was just the same stuff they were doing, just grabbing up all this different stuff, just trying to push out a huge chunk of content. And when they had a
There's
lot of real competition, that affected them.
there's a common trap that happens in business of thinking, hey, this past thing was successful, so let's keep doing that. I've seen it in sports and I've seen it in business alike.
While the opposite can also screw you over.
In
Yeah, in this case, no, they needed to change.
And I'd imagine if they just did a direct DVD subscription model, they might have been able to be a Netflix of anime before that would become a thing. I'm not saying that's what would have happened, but the point is that the model of grab everything was starting to be on its last legs.
Yeah, because I know Bandai, once those 2000 hits, were releasing some just fantastic stuff over here. Like a bit of quality control probably would have done them a lot of good.
The thing is in a lot of successful endeavors, there's usually a big high quality entry to bring people in and a bunch of things to support that. Now, obviously, Bandai was going to have the advantage of Gundam, especially with the as much as people don't like it, the push for things like Seed and of course the popularity of Wing is certainly going to help them.
Not to mention, Cowboy Bebop and various other just all time classics. And by this point, you just didn't see stuff like that from ADV anymore. It was the occasional huge hit, but just so much space in between that, with a lot of properties that probably weren't very cheap.
What would you say would be an example of something that couldn't have come cheap that just didn't take?
I don't think the Final Fantasy one would have been that cheap. It's because it had that name attached to it. And I don't
You're
think that
talking
was
about Unlimited?
yeah. I think that was the one.
Yeah.
And I don't recall that being that big of a hit.
No, I can't see it. It was not good. I know. I can state that with absolute certainty.
Though to be fair, I think it was more volume specifically rather than necessarily a handful of just really expensive. Though there probably again were a few like that.
Um, in the
Well, potentially DN Angel, just because I know the manga from what we've talked about before is really big over there. So I imagine the anime might have been a little on the pricey side.
that would be a surprise because of who animated it. DN Angel was handled by Zabek. Zabek was kind of cheap. The only and I think the only reason they were able to have a legend like Naruhisa Arikawa is because around that time he had his massive falling out with Toei, or more specifically, I think it was him or one of the other founders of Zabek outright declared that he would never work with Toei again because of how much he hated Shirakura. I'd be lying if I said he wasn't. If I said he was an isolated case.
I might also put This Ugly Yet Beautiful World on that, just because the guy next name was still pretty big.
I never even saw that.
It's okay. Like, I enjoyed it. That's about it. It was not received very well from what I remember when it first came out. A lot of that Gynax shine seemed to be going away around this point.
Which we've covered in detail the fall of Gynax.
Yeah. But the point in case, I can't imagine this was going to be, that would have been like the cheapest license. Just because, well, again, you had Evangelion, it was still a huge name.
It is certainly a possibility. I think the overall message that can be stated is ADV has a much larger contribution to the current popularity of anime than it's given credit for.
Oh yeah, a mix of somewhat good timing entering the scene after Akira, some great licensing, just great choices for what to license when they started getting stuff like Evangelion, a big variety of OVAs they started bringing to the market. I'd argue they were one of the most important groups out there from the 90s to early 2000s.
Which I could certainly see that.
I don't know if I'd say they were the most important, but they were definitely up there.
And if I ever got the opportunity, I would love to have some of the people who were instrumental in getting things distributed to come into my temple and discuss those early days just from a historical perspective.
Oh yeah, I'd love to hear some of just the weird stories too that they're bound to have working on some of these. But yeah, with that, I think we've pretty much covered everything ADV related we plan to. Any final thoughts?
No, I think we covered everything that we need to.
All right then. Well, with that, everyone, thank you for joining in and listening to us ramble on about the history of anime. It was fun to use this as an excuse to watch a lot of those older ones I've missed. And, learn a few extra things while researching this. I guess with that, we will see you on the next episode.
Stay frosty.